Imagine a city draped in Spanish moss where grand houses hide whispers of sorrow and the streets are lined with secrets no one dares to speak aloud. Now, imagine a love so forbidden that it defied law, custom, and the very foundations of society. A love that could not be contained, that forced the world to confront the shadows it had long denied. This is the story of a widow and the son of her late husband's slave. A story of courage, defiance, and the eternal truth that the heart cannot be chained. Savannah in 1839 was a place draped in charm, its grand oak trees heavy with moss, its houses painted with elegance, its society ruled by unspoken codes of purity and class. Yet behind that gentility, a darkness lived, an invisible architecture of power and fear, a shadow woven into every conversation, every whispered scandal, every transaction of human bodies sold like livestock under the morning sun. It is in this world that the widow's forbidden love story begins, not as a tale of passion alone, but as an encounter with the collective shadow of her society. For beneath the silken manners and pious words of the slave-holding South, there was an abyss, a repressed awareness that all its order rested on cruelty, and that cruelty, once seen, could not be unseen. When the widow allowed her heart to open to the slave's son, she was not merely crossing a social boundary, she was tearing open the hidden wound of her civilization. The shadow is that which a person, or in this case a culture, refuses to see in itself. Savannah saw itself as Christian, righteous, civilized, but in its shadow lived ownership, domination, and fear. Every slave auction, every lash, every law defending bondage was the shadow's voice whispering beneath hymns of grace. The widow's love drew this shadow to the surface. Her affection for a man whom society called property was a mirror reflecting back to her world the truth it denied, that beneath color and class there exists a shared humanity, and to deny it is to live in illusion. In loving him, she forced her own reflection to expand, to hold the darkness her society had rejected. It was not only a personal act of love, it was an act of psychological revolution. When the heart dares to love what the mind has been taught to fear, it stirs the deepest forces in human nature. The widow's passion was dangerous, not because it violated law, but because it threatened the psychic balance of her entire world. Her peers depended on the illusion of separation. They required that black remain opposite to white, servant opposite to master, woman opposite to power. By uniting those opposites in her secret union, she shattered the fragile mask of order and brought forth the chaos of truth. The town's outrage was not moral, it was existential. Her marriage illuminated their shadow, and what is revealed cannot be controlled. In every human heart lives both light and darkness, and it is the denial of one that gives power to the other. The widow's decision to embrace her forbidden love was the beginning of her own individuation, the confrontation with her inner shadow. She too was a product of her world. She had once believed in the comfort of rules, in the sanctity of her position, in the false righteousness of her race. Yet loneliness has a way of softening certainty. Widowhood stripped her of the illusion of permanence, leaving only the raw ache of emptiness. When she looked into the eyes of the slave's son, she saw not defiance but reflection, the same longing for dignity, for connection, for meaning. In that moment, the walls between oppressor and oppressed, between mistress and servant, cracked open, and through the fracture shone something terrible and beautiful: recognition. But society's shadow does not surrender easily. Once revealed, it attacks. The whispers in Savannah became daggers of rumor. The church turned its face. Even her own kin recoiled, as if she had committed a sin against the order of creation itself. Yet their condemnation was proof of the very sickness she had exposed. The fear that drove them was not fear of her lover's race. It was fear of seeing themselves. They had built a world on the denial of their shared humanity. and her marriage made that denial impossible. The shadow she had unveiled was no longer contained in the dark corners of plantation houses. It now stood in the light of day, demanding to be acknowledged. The forbidden wedding thus became a symbolic exorcism. It was as though all the hidden guilt of Savannah, all the blood that had seeped into its soil, rose up in that act of union. Her love was not pure in the sentimental sense. It was turbulent, haunted, full of contradiction, but it was real. And reality is the enemy of delusion. To love truthfully in a false world is to suffer, yet it is also to awaken. The widow and her lover became unwilling prophets, their lives a mirror of the collective psyche yearning for wholeness. Through their suffering, they revealed that healing cannot begin until the shadow is faced, until the darkness is seen not as an enemy, but as a necessary counterpart to light. The people of Savannah called her mad, sinful, bewitched. But beneath their condemnation lay an unspoken envy, for she had touched a freedom they could not imagine, the freedom that comes when fear no longer rules the soul. Her love, born in defiance, was a descent into the unconscious of her culture, a descent into everything polite society refused to feel. In loving the slave's son, she had embraced the rejected half of her world, and in doing so, she glimpsed a unity her peers could not endure. The shadow she confronted was not only Savannah's, it was humanity's, the ancient terror of equality, the fear that without our masks, we are all the same. Thus, the widow's forbidden love was not simply a scandalous romance, but a revelation. It showed that beneath every empire of hierarchy lies a trembling truth, that the oppressor and the oppressed are bound by the same soul. The shadow of Savannah had long been buried in silence, but through her, it spoke. And though her society sought to erase her story, the echo of that shadow still lingers, whispering through time, reminding us that until we face the darkness we have created, we can never truly be free. In the stillness of her widowhood, when the laughter of her youth had vanished and the air in her grand Savannah home hung heavy with memory, the widow began to hear the faint stirrings of something she had long suppressed. It was not the call of society or duty, but the trembling voice of her own soul. She had lived for years in a world that defined her by her husband's name, by propriety, by silence. Her emotions were meant to remain behind lace and etiquette, her desires locked away behind the cold iron gates of respectability. Yet in the presence of her late husband's slave son, something within her began to awaken, something dangerous, something vital. He was a reflection of the very energy she had buried beneath grief and conformity. In his youth and strength, she saw not just forbidden flesh, but the lost part of herself that had been denied expression. He represented the anima, the living image of her inner life that had been silenced beneath centuries of control. The human soul is not a creature of boundaries. It yearns to reconcile the opposites within, the rational and the instinctual, the spiritual and the sensual. The widow's desire was not mere passion. It was the manifestation of the deep psychological truth that the heart seeks wholeness through the embrace of what it has been taught to fear. In him, she saw freedom. In her, he saw humanity. He, the son of a man once owned by her family, was the embodiment of the life that slavery had tried to destroy, the unbroken essence of spirit that no chain could hold. She, a woman bound by social rituals, was entranced not only by his presence, but by what he symbolized, authenticity. Their connection defied logic and morality as defined by their time, because it was born not in rebellion, but in recognition. It was not just two bodies meeting, it was two souls remembering that they had once been whole. Desire in such a context was an act of rebellion, not only against society, but against the psyche's long enslavement to fear. The widow's longing was not lust in its shallow form. It was a yearning for unity, for the integration of her hidden self. In loving him, she touched the wildness that her culture had labeled sin. He became the mirror in which her inner woman, long buried under obedience and restraint, could finally see herself. The tenderness she felt was inseparable from terror, because to love him meant to dissolve the boundaries that had kept her safe from the truth. She began to sense that love, in its purest essence, has little regard for race, class, or rule. It only knows the magnetic pull toward completion. Her attraction was therefore not moral defiance, but metaphysical necessity, the psyche's cry to reclaim what had been exiled. But in 1839, Savannah, desire was dangerous when it dared to cross color or status. The mere thought of affection between a white widow and a black man threatened to unmask the hypocrisy that lay beneath the entire system. It revealed that domination and purity were illusions, maintained only by the suppression of the human heart. For her, to feel tenderness for him was to betray her race, her church, her gender's assigned place in the hierarchy. Yet, what was called betrayal was, in truth, awakening. Every glance they exchanged carried centuries of unsaid truth, the truth that love, when stripped of fear, exposes the spiritual equality that society cannot abide. In their encounters, often cloaked in secrecy, the widow experienced the merging of two inner worlds. He, though born in bondage, possessed an inner nobility untouched by the chains of ownership. She, though born into privilege, carried within her the ache of captivity to social law. Together they crossed a threshold that neither could return from. Their union, however brief or doomed, was an act of soul alchemy. The widow, by surrendering to the forbidden, began to integrate the repressed parts of her being, her sensuality, her courage, her defiance, and the man, by being loved as an equal, began to reclaim the dignity that history had stolen from him. Each became a vessel for the other's transformation, revealing that love, when it moves against oppression, becomes not just emotion but liberation. The forbidden nature of their bond only intensified its psychological power. Every secret meeting carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths, every brush of skin a reminder that they were not supposed to exist as equals, yet they did. Through her love, she tasted a freedom she had never known, and through her, he experienced the unimaginable, a woman from the oppressor's world seeing him not as property, but as person. This union existed in a twilight realm between sin and sanctity, between the visible and the invisible. It was both an earthly passion and a spiritual awakening, for it demanded that they both face the deepest truths of their existence. In him, she encountered her anima, the archetypal force of life, passion, and intuition. He was not simply a man, he was the embodiment of the unlived life within her. His laughter, his eyes, his defiance, all reminded her of what she had forgotten in her years of obedience to a loveless moral order. Through him, she felt the pulse of creation itself, the same pulse that her society had crushed beneath sermons and chains. The forbidden desire was therefore not a fall from grace, but a descent into truth. To love him was to remember the divine essence of being, stripped of masks and fear. The tragedy, however, was inevitable. Such unions could not survive in a world that had not yet awakened to its own soul. But even as society condemned them, something irreversible had occurred. The widow's passion revealed the hidden face of human nature, the longing for wholeness that transcends every boundary. Her love for him was the soul's rebellion against separation, a cry for unity in a world obsessed with division. And though her body would grow old and her name fade into scandal, her act of desire would remain eternal, echoing through time as the voice of the repressed divine feminine calling the world back to itself. There are moments in history when two people, simply by loving one another, become symbols of something much greater than themselves. The widow and the slave's son were never merely lovers in the human sense. They were archetypes, the eternal figures of the lover and the outcast, reborn within the boundaries of an unforgiving world. In Savannah's rigid order of 1839, they lived on opposite poles of existence. She was born into privilege, wrapped in silk and silence. He was born into servitude, marked from birth by the world's cruel hierarchies. Yet the same society that separated them also ensured that both lived in exile, the woman from her own heart, the man from his own freedom. Their meeting, their love, was the convergence of these two forms of exile. The lover within them sought union, while the outcast within them understood that such a union would come only at the price of rejection by all they knew. The lover, in its truest form, is not about romance, but about the pursuit of wholeness. It is a force that transcends boundaries, seeking to heal division and dissolve the illusion of separateness. When the widow's heart turned toward the enslaved man's son, she was not just defying her society's laws, she was embodying this archetype. In her love, she reached for the truth that all souls are made of the same essence. Yet love that aims to reveal truth in a world built on lies is destined to suffer. The lover's path is always entwined with the shadow of pain, because love exposes what fear has hidden. Every stolen moment between them was both a sanctuary and a crucible. To love him meant to live in light for an instant and then fall into darkness again, knowing that society would never forgive such illumination. He too carried the archetype of the outcast. From birth, his existence had been shaped by the boundaries others had drawn. His mother's tears, his father's chains, the whispers of the white world around him, all told him that he was less, that his dreams were forbidden, that the world was not made for his freedom. And yet within him lived the same human hunger for recognition, for dignity, for love. When the widow saw him, she saw beyond the imposed mask of inferiority. She saw the hidden king within the outcast, the unbroken spark of divinity that no whip or law could extinguish. Through her gaze, he began to see himself anew, not as property, not as shame, but as being. Their love, therefore, was an act of creation. Through each other, they gave birth to their true selves. But to become the lover and the outcast in a world that worships conformity is to walk into exile willingly. The moment they allowed their hearts to speak, they were expelled from the symbolic garden of social acceptance. The widow became a pariah among her kind, condemned as fallen, mad, unworthy of her lineage. He became a fugitive, hunted not for a crime of violence, but for the crime of being loved by the wrong woman. Together, they entered the wilderness of the soul, where love and suffering are indistinguishable. In that wilderness, stripped of illusion, they discovered a freedom that the world could not comprehend. They learned that love is not a gift society grants, it is a birthright that transcends law. Their story carries within it the eternal rhythm of myth, the crossing of thresholds, the descent into darkness, the trial, and the faint glimmer of transcendence. The widow's defiance was more than personal, it was mythic. She became the figure of the lover who chooses truth over comfort, who embraces the outcast rather than the idol, who accepts the world's rejection to preserve the soul's integrity. In loving him, she accepted her role as the exile, stepping outside the circle of the familiar into the territory of the sacred unknown. He, in turn, became the embodiment of the redemptive outcast, the one through whom the hidden grace of humanity is revealed. Their union, brief and doomed as it might have been, was an initiation into the deepest law of existence, that love cannot be confined by systems of power, because love itself is the energy that dissolves them. To their society, they were sinners, mad with passion, possessed by something unnatural. But to the deeper psyche of humanity, they were something else. Symbols of the union that all divided souls yearn for. Every culture has feared this union because it undermines the structures that maintain control. To love across class, race, or order is to prove that the hierarchies of the world are illusions. The lover and the outcast therefore exist to remind humanity of what it has forgotten, that divinity hides in what is despised. Their suffering becomes sacred, not because pain is noble in itself, but because it reveals that what society casts out is often what it most needs to be healed. The townspeople of Savannah could not see this. They looked at the widow and her lover and saw only scandal, moral decay, the unraveling of order. But beneath their outrage was envy and fear. The envy of those who secretly longed for authenticity, and the fear of those who sensed that the world they upheld was a fragile lie. For love has a way of showing people what they truly are. Her act of devotion to him was therefore not a fall from grace, but an ascension into truth. In the union of the lover and the outcast, the story of humanity itself is retold, the story of separation and return, exile and homecoming, sin and redemption. In their brief and tragic connection, they embodied something eternal. The widow and the enslaved man's son became vessels of transformation, living symbols of what happens when love steps beyond fear. Their wedding, though forbidden, was a ceremony not only of defiance, but of revelation. They became myth in motion, two souls daring to unite what the world insists must remain divided. And though their society erased their names and condemned their memory, the archetypes they awakened cannot die. The lover and the outcast live on in every human heart that has dared to love what the world rejects. In every act of courage that chooses truth over acceptance, and in every moment when love becomes an act of sacred rebellion against the tyranny of separation. To live within the confines of a rigid world is to carry a mask, and to love against its rules is to shatter that mask forever. The widow of Savannah had been raised to see herself as a reflection of her husband's name, her lineage, and her position. Her life was an inheritance of expectation, to grieve with dignity, to live quietly, and to die respected. Yet, within the stillness of her widowhood, her heart began to feel the stirring of something that had no place in that polished mirror. When her eyes met the son of her husband's former slave, something irreversible began within her. It was not simply love that she felt. It was recognition, as though her soul had found its missing half in a forbidden place. But this recognition demanded a price. It required the death of the woman she had been, the burial of the identity her society adored, and the painful birth of something unknown, unaccepted, yet profoundly alive. Identity in such a world was a prison made of invisible bars. She was expected to be gentle, chaste, and submissive, confined to her role like a character in a script she had never written. He, the man she loved, had also been given an identity not of his own making, that of property, servant, shadow. Their union therefore represented the collapse of these false selves. For her to love him meant that she had to destroy the world that had defined her, and for him to love her meant that he had to step out of the role that the world had carved into his flesh since birth. It was a double transformation, a shared crossing from illusion to authenticity. The death that occurred was not of body, but of persona. The rebirth that followed was not social, but spiritual. The moment she chose to stand beside him was the moment she ceased to exist as the widow of Savannah. That identity, gilded in sorrow and reputation, dissolved into dust. The whispers that once praised her mourning now spat venom, calling her insane, immoral, possessed. Her home became a haunted space, filled not with mourning, but with judgment. The women who once visited her with sympathy now crossed the street to avoid her. The men who once tipped their hats spoke her name only with disgust, yet in losing their approval, she found her truth. The woman who had lived behind veils and rituals of propriety began to breathe for the first time. This was not merely rebellion, it was resurrection. To love him, she had to die in the eyes of her world, and in that symbolic death, she discovered a self that no one could define for her again. For the man she loved, the transformation was even more profound. He had lived under the crushing weight of invisibility, his existence dictated by others, his humanity denied. To stand beside her in love was to risk everything, to claim an identity that the law itself forbade him to have. When she looked at him as an equal, she did more than defy convention. She spoke into being a new self for him, one that neither whip nor law could destroy. In her gaze, he was no longer the son of a slave, but a man. Their marriage, though condemned, became a sacred act of naming. It named him free in a world that called him property. It named her brave in a world that called her broken. Together, they became living proof that identity is not granted by society. It is born through choice, through courage, through love that transcends the cages of definition. But rebirth never comes without pain. Theirs was not a romantic awakening wrapped in sweetness. It was a crucifixion of the self, a burning of the old to make way for the new. There were nights when she wept, torn between the remnants of her old life and the uncertain horizon of the new one. There were days when he feared that his love had doomed them both, that the world would crush them before they could fully live. Yet, within that suffering, there was light, a clarity that comes only when all illusions are stripped away. They no longer belonged to the categories of master and servant, widow and slave's son. They had stepped into the realm of the human, where identity is not a chain, but a truth born of experience. In many ways, their forbidden wedding was a ritual death. The ceremony, whether public or secret, was an act of symbolic burial. The widow's name, once a badge of honor, was laid to rest. The man's chains, though perhaps not physically gone, lost their power to define him. And in that space between death and life, they found something sacred, a form of existence that neither history nor hatred could fully destroy. They became ghosts to their society, but souls to each other. In the eyes of their peers, they had vanished. In their own, they had finally appeared. This paradox is the essence of transformation. Every soul that seeks truth must die to the falsehoods that shaped it, and their love was the battlefield upon which this truth was fought for and won. The rebirth of identity they experienced was not merely personal, it carried the weight of humanity's own evolution. Their union was a small echo of a greater law, that no system built on domination can last forever, because the soul will always seek its wholeness. In them, that wholeness took the form of love, a force that refused to bow to labels. Through their suffering, they revealed that identity is fluid, alive, and born in defiance of fear. She was no longer a widow defined by grief. She became a woman defined by choice. He was no longer the shadow of his father's bondage. He became a man reborn through the light of love. And though the world around them refused to acknowledge this transformation, history cannot silence it. Theirs is the eternal story of death and rebirth, the destruction of all that is false to reveal the essence that is real. In losing everything, they gained themselves. In dying to their identities, they were finally born. Their love became a testament to the deepest human truth, that the soul's liberation begins the moment one dares to die to the image the world demands and live in the truth the heart reveals. In 1839, Savannah, the social fabric was woven from threads of fear, hierarchy, and separation. Every street, every household, every gathering held the unspoken understanding that the world was divided along rigid lines, master and servant, white and black, rich and poor, male and female. It was a delicate architecture maintained not only through law and custom, but through the collective psyche of a society terrified of unity across these boundaries. Into this world stepped the widow and the son of her late husband's slave. And in doing so, they became the embodiment of a force that society could neither control nor understand: the integrative power of love. Their union, innocent in intent yet revolutionary in consequence, revealed the hidden fear that underpinned the town's order. It was not simply the taboo of race or class that provoked outrage, but the realization that two souls could bridge the very boundaries the community had invested its entire sense of security in preserving. The collective fear of integration is ancient. It arises from the human tendency to categorize, to separate what is familiar from what is feared, to erect walls that protect the fragile ego of the group. In Savannah, these walls were literal and symbolic: plantation gates, church pews, and rigid etiquette. But they were also psychological, invisible barriers erected in the minds of every citizen. They told themselves that the world was safer when people remained in their assigned places, when bodies and roles were predictable, when no love or desire could challenge the hierarchy. The widow's affection for the slave's son shattered this illusion. By crossing the boundary society had declared absolute, she forced the town to confront a truth it had long repressed: that the human soul recognizes no hierarchy, no skin, no social status. This fear was magnified by projection. When the townspeople condemned the couple, they were reacting not solely to the marriage itself, but to the reflection it cast upon their own lives. Their anger and disgust were disguises for envy, guilt, and dread. Envy, because they secretly longed for the freedom to follow their hearts without fear of judgment. Guilt, because they recognized, however unconsciously, the injustice upon which their lives were built. Dread, because they glimpsed the dissolution of the walls they relied upon to feel safe. In the eyes of the town, the widow and the young man became monstrous, dangerous, capable of unraveling a world that could not endure truth. Their love was the catalyst that revealed the collective shadow of Savannah, showing that the fear of integration is rooted not in morality, but in the terror of facing one's own suppressed humanity. Integration is never merely a social act. It is a psychic event. When two individuals from opposed worlds choose to unite, they trigger an upheaval in the collective unconscious. The widow and her lover were living embodiments of this principle. Their bond symbolized not only the meeting of two people, but the reconciliation of opposites: wealth and poverty, freedom and bondage, feminine and masculine energies, life and shadow. Society, conditioned to fear such reconciliation, responded with hostility because it threatened the very sense of separation that gave individuals and the community its identity. The fear was not rational. It was deep, instinctual, and archetypal. It was the same fear that has haunted all societies when boundaries are blurred and divisions challenged. The townspeople attempted to control this fear through shaming, ostracism, and rumor. Every whisper became a weapon, every glance a tool to reinforce division. Yet no amount of condemnation could erase the reality that the couple had bridged the gap the town feared to acknowledge. In their private union, they demonstrated that integration is not a threat, but a natural law of existence. Every person carries within them the potential for connection across difference. Every soul longs for the unity that society suppresses. The widow and the young man's love forced Savannah to confront its own fear of this truth. And in that confrontation lay both its horror and its insight. The power of their union lay not only in the act of marriage, but in what it represented for the collective consciousness. By loving across imposed boundaries, they became a mirror for the town, revealing what was repressed and feared. That separation is an illusion, that oppression is unsustainable, and that humanity cannot be divided without consequence. In every act of integration, there is resistance, and in Savannah, that resistance took the form of scandal and outrage. Yet the very energy of fear proves the potency of the act itself. The town's terror confirmed that the widow and her lover had touched a truth too powerful to be ignored, a truth that the human spirit, in its deepest longing, will always pursue. Through their forbidden marriage, the widow and her partner exposed the shadow of collective fear, demonstrating that the integration of opposites, though resisted, is inevitable in the unfolding of human consciousness. Their love became a symbol of reconciliation, a reminder that society may attempt to suppress it, but the force of connection, empathy, and shared humanity cannot be extinguished by law, custom, or judgment. In their courage to unite, they revealed the truth that the world fears the most, that separation is fragile and love is unstoppable. The story of the widow and the son of her late husband's slave is not merely a historical curiosity, it is a living testament to the archetypal truth that wholeness emerges from the union of opposites. In the rigid social hierarchy of 1839 Savannah, everything was divided and compartmentalized: black and white, master and servant, male and female, rich and poor, life and death. Society insisted upon these divisions as if they were natural law, yet the human soul has always sought what society fears: the reconciliation of opposites, the merging of what is separated. In the forbidden wedding, the widow and her lover enacted this eternal principle. Their union was a symbolic marriage not only of two individuals, but of all the contradictions their world could not reconcile. She embodied grace, lineage, and privilege. He embodied strength, freedom, and the resilience of the oppressed. Their coming together was the literal and metaphorical crossing of boundaries, a manifestation of the soul's longing for integration. Every culture has myths that celebrate the marriage of opposites: night and day, sun and moon, life and death, heaven and earth. These myths exist because the human psyche recognizes that existence is sustained by balance. The widow and the young man's love mirrors this timeless law. She, though wealthy and powerful by societal standards, was spiritually impoverished, confined by expectation and fear. He, though born into bondage, carried an inner wealth, a vitality and authenticity unbroken by oppression. When they united, they completed each other, not because one elevated the other, but because together they formed a whole that neither could achieve alone. Their marriage became a living emblem of harmony, the embodiment of a truth that society in Savannah could neither understand nor permit. The tension between opposites is what gives life its richness, but society has always feared it. Opposites disturb certainty. They provoke anxiety because they reveal the artificiality of divisions imposed by law, custom, or habit. In the case of Savannah, the town's condemnation of the widow and her lover was evidence of the power of this union. People were terrified not merely by the crossing of social norms, but by the realization that these norms were arbitrary, fragile constructs. The widow and her lover, in their defiance, demonstrated a higher order, a natural, inevitable law of wholeness that surpasses social constructs. Their love, therefore, was simultaneously scandalous and sacred, dangerous and necessary, human and archetypal. In psychology and in myth, the marriage of opposites often signals transformation. The process is never simple. It requires courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to confront fear and societal judgment. For the widow, this meant abandoning her old identity as a respectable widow, dissolving the life she had known, and daring to embrace love that society deemed impossible. For her lover, it meant stepping into an equality that the law and tradition denied him, claiming a humanity that was always his but had been unrecognized. In uniting, they enacted a ritual of transformation: the death of the old selves, the dissolution of imposed identities, and the birth of something entirely new. This is the essence of the eternal marriage of opposites, creation through synthesis, wholeness through union. Their love also illuminates a universal truth, that opposites are not enemies but complementary forces. Light cannot exist without shadow, freedom cannot exist without restraint, life cannot exist without death, and love cannot exist without the recognition of difference. By daring to unite across the ultimate divides, race, class, social expectation, they demonstrated that the most profound reconciliation occurs where it is most forbidden, where fear is most intense, and where the world resists with greatest force. Their courage was not in ignoring difference, but in embracing it, in allowing it to coexist, and in recognizing that the synthesis of opposites is the only path to wholeness. Even though society condemned their union, the symbolic truth of their marriage endures. Their love, though temporary in the material sense, exists eternally in the realm of archetype. A reminder that wholeness demands the courage to confront division, the willingness to embrace difference, and the capacity to unite what has been separated. The widow and her lover became living vessels of the eternal principle that love, when fully realized, is the harmonizing force of existence. In their union, society saw scandal, but the psyche recognized revelation. They were proof that opposites, once joined, create a new order, one that transcends fear, defies limitation, and affirms the deepest human and cosmic truths.